Hello there, and welcome to London History at Home's fifth episode in the Paranormal London series, Tales of Paranormal London. This time we're going to East London. So it's the tales, ghosts and ghouls and wizards of East London. My name's Rebecca. This is Gordon.
Hello.
We were both tour guides in real life. We both racked up about 15 years of that. And now we're virtual tour guides, which we're still a bit new at, but we're giving it a go at being virtual tour guides. So without any further ado, let's go to the area of East London and get spooked. So if you're not familiar with the area of London, this is London, and this roughly is East London. So this is the bit that we're going to be covering today. And we're going to start out with
Magical East End, which has been a home to more than a few mystics, magicians and sorcerers. Nicholas Culpeper set up an apothecary shop on Commercial Street in the 1640s. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Culpeper offered his medical services at an affordable price. He also translated and wrote medical books in plain English and sold them at a low price as self-help books. In his own book, English, he suggested cheap, homemade herbal remedies for many maladies, including digitalis for heart problems. The 17th century medical profession were a little upset that Culpeper was suggesting medical help should be for all, not only those who could afford exorbitant doctors' fees, and it's perhaps for this reason, rather than any actual supernatural evidence, that he was accused of witchcraft in 1643. It's unlikely that he did have any magical abilities, but he did co-write an essay on A Prophecy of the White King with William Lilly, which appeared to predict the death of King Charles I and England's brief flirtation with being a republic. Another scientist got a reputation for magical powers was John Dee. He was born near the Tower of London in 1527 and went on to study geometry and mathematics, his expertise proving invaluable to those navigating the world's oceans during the golden age of discovery. In 1555, he was arrested on suspicion of witchcraft, or calculating, as they called it, after he had cast a horoscope which Queen Mary I didn't like. Dee managed to talk himself out of any punishment, luckily for him at that point. In 1558, he became the court astrologer, astronomer, scientist, and sorcerer to Queen Elizabeth I. It's also suggested he was a spy for her. Some of his letters to her were even signed 007. Strange but true. Dee would entertain the court with magic tricks, which were in fact chemical reactions. A talented Tudor scientist and mathematician, he also believed in the supernatural. Dee had a crystal ball and a portable spirit mirror, a polished piece of obsidian from Mexico, in which he attempted scrying to contact spirits. Try as he might, he had no success, so he turned to mediums. One of these mediums was Edward Kelly, with whom Dee made attempts to contact angels. Dee said the angels had dictated several books to him in Enochian, the language of angels, which Dee translated. Dee is sometimes cited as the inspiration behind Prospero in Shakespeare's The Tempest. In 1710, 22-year-old Emanuel Swedenborg arrived in London for the first time. He was to return many times over his lifetime and usually lodged in Well-Close Square in the East End. He was an accomplished scientist working for the Swedish House of Nobles. After the 1740s, Swedenborg began to spend more time in London publishing mystical books under a pseudonym. Swedenborg had started to experience vivid dreams and visions and believed that he could speak to angels and devils and was able to visit the afterlife. Swedenborg did seem to display some sort of psychic ability. In 1759, he seemed to psychically sense a fire in Stockholm when he was 400 kilometers away. In 1758, he told Queen Louisa Ulrika of Sweden the secret that only she and her recently deceased brother were aware of. Throughout his investigations into the supernatural, he had continued to publish mainstream scientific papers in Sweden, and his ideas on neurology and cosmology were almost supernaturally ahead of their time. He even invented a flying machine in 1714. Swedenborg suffered a stroke while living in London and accurately predicted the date of his own death, March the 29th, 1772. He was buried in the Swedish church in Shadwell, but his skull was stolen. His remains were returned to Sweden 100 years ago, and in the 1970s, his skull was finally identified and returned to Sweden. His skull was said to be unusually long and narrow, with some saying this could have been a symptom of his psychic abilities. Mm-hmm. The Kabbalist Samuel Falk was known as the Baal Shem of London. In Judaism, a Baal Shem was said to be able to heal, perform miracles, and cast protective spells. Falk arrived in London in 1736, having escaped being burned as a sorcerer in Westphalia. He lived in Well-Close Square and would probably have known Emanuel Swedenborg. It's said that Falk visited Epping Forest frequently to perform mystical rites, or some say to bury treasure. On one visit, the carriage wheel fell off on Whitechapel Road, but the wheel magically followed the carriage all the way to Epping Forest. Some of his other magical feats that have been recorded include healing a child's eyes after they had been damaged in a fire, magically transporting objects from one place to another, and it's said that he saved the great synagogue of London from a fire by writing a Hebrew spell beside the door. It's also said that Falk created a golem, which still exists somewhere in East London. Falk died in 1782 and was buried in the Alderney Road Cemetery in Mile End, and some still visit his grave to pay their respects by leaving a pebble on his tomb. Ghostly hospitals,
or sites where hospitals used to be, seem to be a site for a sort of magnet for supernatural activity. Every hospital in London seems to have a ghostly nun or a ghostly nurse. And there are a few hospitals in East London, or were in East London. The one on the screen here is the London Hospital on Whitechapel Road, which still exists, it's still there. It was founded in the 1740s, and this engraving is from the 18th century, soon after it was founded. And the idea was that it was a hospital open to all who needed it, so anyone could go, you didn't have to pay. The hospital has a classic grey lady ghost, as many other hospitals around London and around the country do. And some psychics have claimed to have contacted Joseph Merrick, also known as the Elephant Man, who lived at the hospital in the last years of his life. There is a superstition at the Royal London Hospital, at least there was, I don't know whether it's still adhered to, that if the shutters, the window shutters, aren't closed at night, someone will die unexpectedly where a shutter was left open. Fairly nearby to Whitechapel in Hackney was the Mothers' Hospital in Hackney. This is an old sketch of it when it was being planned. It was opened by the Salvation Army in 1889, initially well, what in the 19th century was dreadful, the unmarried women who were having their babies. It eventually, actually not soon after that, became just a general maternity hospital for the people of the East End. It's not there anymore, by the way, it was demolished in the 1980s. The Mothers' Hospital used to have a ghost, though. Nurses who were on night shift would report sometimes feeling somebody shake their shoulder to wake them up, and they'd wake up suddenly thinking, oh God, it's matron, and there was nobody there. The story goes that this is the ghost of a nurse who fell asleep when she was on a night shift, and because she'd fallen asleep, a child died, and she wanted to make sure that no other nurse fell asleep on her night shift, so she'd go around shaking the nurses awake. This is Claybury Hospital in Woodford Bridge, or rather was in Woodford Bridge. It was opened in 1893 as a psychiatric hospital, although they called them something rather less pleasant in the 19th century. It wasn't quite as dreadful as other psychiatric hospitals at the time, but it still wasn't a very nice place. And in the 1990s, it was made into luxury apartments. And this is it in a more modern day. But you can see it's still got that kind of red brick 19th century hospital look to it. Early residents of the complex said they saw apparitions of a very tall man would stalk around the grounds in the apartments, and lights would turn themselves on and off. One family reported a young teenage girl appearing on their entry phone, but then there was nobody there, and they said there was no way she could have gone anywhere. And I think it was the same family reported that kitchen and the contents were sort of neatly lined up on the kitchen table. So a very tidy poltergeist. And others have reported kind of scratching noises at their front doors. And this is very eerie. I don't think I'd stay in an apartment where this happened. Disembodied voices whispering their own names in the flat. I think I'd move quite quickly, no matter how luxury the luxury apartments were. And this is the Google Street view of Liverpool Street Railway Station, the back of Liverpool Street Railway Station. Liverpool Street Railway Station, or this end of it, stands on the site of the original Bedlam Royal Hospital, excuse me. It was nicknamed Bedlam by Londoners, and that's where the word comes from. It was, again, a psychiatric hospital, though they didn't call it that. And they were not, patients were not treated perhaps quite as kindly as they should have been at this Bedlam Royal Hospital and its successors. Until its modern successor, of course. So the station, Liverpool Street Station, is said to be haunted. That's the map of the original Bedlam on the site. Bethlem Royal Hospital, rather. Liverpool Street Railway Station is said to be haunted by one of the former patients of Bethlem Royal Hospital. She's said to be heard screaming in it. So the story goes that in the early part of the 18th century, one of the patients admitted a woman would always carry a coin in her fist, and she couldn't be made to let it go because of whatever illness she was suffering from. She liked to clutch the coin. But when she died, one of the slightly mean-spirited members of staff prized her hand open and took her coin away, stole her coin. And the theory is that the screaming woman that is heard at Liverpool Street Railway Station is the spirit of this woman either trying to find her coin or find a member of staff to take revenge on her.
Haunted transport. As we've learnt in previous episodes, the London Underground is a good place for ghost hunting. We do have a few tube ghosts in East London, but we've got some other travel-related ghosts too. Many places in London claim that their ghost stories are the result of being built upon a plague pit. In some cases, it's dubious there was a plague pit, but at Aldgate's underground station, it was definitely built on a burial ground. It was built in the 1870s on the site of a plague pit described by Daniel Defoe in Journal of the Plague Year. Defoe described 1,114 bodies being thrown into a mass grave in the space of 2 weeks in 1665. Some of those burials were discovered during an archaeological survey by the Museum of London at Aldgate Station in 2005. Aldgate Station and the nearby Aldgate East Station had the reputation of being London's most haunted underground stations, with sightings reportedly being recorded in the station log. Passengers and staff have frequently heard footsteps approaching and passing them by, but no one being seen. The most well-known ghostly encounter at Aldgate took place in the late 20th century when a maintenance worker was working in the tunnels late at night. He slipped and accidentally touched the conductor rail, which hadn't been switched off. The 20,000-volt rail should have killed him, but he was simply knocked unconscious. One of his colleagues reported that just before he touched the rail, he had seen the image of an old woman leaning over the man and stroking his hair. It said the woman was the ghost of a woman who died in the station during World War II when she fell onto the same before it was turned off, and she had saved the man's life by somehow cushioning him from the electric shock. Near the entrance of Bethnal Green Station, a dark, intimidating figure is seen, thought to be the ghost of Bishop Edward Bonner. We've spoken about Bonner before. In West London, where his residence of Fulham Palace holds the ghosts of those he tortured or killed. He also had a home in Bethnal Green, known as either Bishop's Hall or Bonner's Hall. The building has since been demolished and Victoria Park now stands on the site. Those walking in Victoria Park late at night have seen the ghost of Bonner's coach pulled by dark black horses racing across the park. Another ghostly coach is seen in Wanstead Park. In the 16th century, Wanstead House was one of the homes of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Dudley, of course, was a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, with rumours still flying that he was her lover. He died suddenly in 1588, and the Queen was heartbroken, locking herself away for several days and keeping his last letter at her bedside until the day she died. It's said that the ghostly coach is that of Queen Elizabeth I, still repeating a journey to see her beloved Dudley. A later resident of Wanstead House was Catherine Tilney Long, who had inherited the house when a younger brother died in childhood. Before she was married, she was considered the richest commoner in the country. But sadly, the man she married lost much of her money through debts, extravagance, and gambling, and he carried on numerous public affairs. Catherine died in 1825, and soon after her death, her husband demolished Wanstead Hall to try and pay off some of his gambling debts. Catherine's ghost is seen on the site of her home, heartbroken that her home was destroyed. The Black Wall Tunnel first opened in 1897. At the time, it was the longest underwater tunnel in the world at 6,200 feet. At the southern entrance to the tunnel, kind motorcyclists will sometimes stop for a young woman hitchhiking. She always asks for a particular address in Leigh-on-Sea near Southend. If the motorcyclist agrees, the young woman gratefully climbs onto the back of the motorcycle, only to disappear without a trace as the motorbike goes through the Black Wall Tunnel. One curious motorcyclist actually tracked down the address his spectral hitchhiker requested, only to discover that years earlier, a woman living at that address had died in a motorcycle accident in the Black Wall Tunnel in the 1960s. Some have suggested that the ghost only tries to flag down motorbikes that are going too fast to try and prevent further accidents. A group of people driving past the City of London cemetery on Aldersbrook Road in 1993 were shocked when a woman ran out in front of the car. Only 2 of the 4 people in the car saw her, and they screamed because they thought they would hit her. The car passed right through the woman, and there was no sign of her in the rear view mirror. The 2 people who saw her said she was of Asian heritage, and her face was filled with fear and regret. Spooky cemeteries.
With the ghost of a woman dodging a car next to a cemetery, we've got a few cemetery ghosts in East London. So this is the City of London cemetery, where the ghost of the woman was seen nearby. Not particularly near the City of London, by the way, it's more in East London. In the City of London cemetery, locals have seen one of the gravestones glowing bright orange at night for no apparent reason. The obvious reason is that some builder left his lamp there, but none could be found. No explanation could be found. This is Wanstead Church, St. Mary's Church in Wanstead. In the churchyard at Wanstead, the phantasm of a skeleton is said to be seen wandering the graveyard at night, pushing a cart. It's said to be the ghost of a woman whose wife's body was taken by grave robbers, which was a real threat. I know it sounds like a horror story thing, but it was a real threat to people in the 18th century when there really were grave robbers who were stealing bodies to sell to nefarious doctors. In a weird coincidence, in the very same churchyard, there's another ghost of a woman who is said to be looking for her husband. It's not been suggested that the 2 are related, but if it is possible, I hope those 2 ghosts find each other and find happiness in the other realms. In this same church, actually, St. Mary's Church, Wanstead, I think we've had a Dick Turpin ghost in every single episode that we've done of this, so we'll get one in here too. It's said to be haunted by Dick Turpin. The church itself is said to be haunted by Dick Turpin. Largely because in the church records there's a Thomas Turpin. Thomas Turpin, who was buried at the church in 1719, who's said to be a relative. Dick Turpin's family were from East London, so it's not completely crazy. It said Thomas Turpin was an uncle or something, and that Dick Turpin lived in the area, and it's in happy childhood memories. Apparently ghosts often return to places they had happy childhood memories. Another St. Mary's in Walthamstow this time. In the churchyard of St. Mary's is the tomb of Thomas Turner, who was from the City of London originally in Aldersgate. It's a very plain tomb with yew trees each corner, very common for yew trees to be in graveyards, and there are several tombs in Wanstead, several tombs in Walthamstow whose corners. There's a superstition, or at least there was a superstition, I don't know whether it's in this modern era, the local children still do this. There used to be a superstition that if you put a penny on the Thomas Turner tomb and danced around it a number of times, a ghost would appear. Whether that was the ghost of Thomas Turner or not is slightly unclear. Thomas Turner, actually, he was a great philanthropist and left a lot of money in his will for the underprivileged people in the area of Walthamstow. So his name is still remembered, even if it is as a sort of childhood rite of passage.
Superstitions. Londoners have been a superstitious lot throughout history. And there's a few more London-specific superstitions in East London. There was an old superstition, possibly dating back to Saxon times, that murderers who committed suicide should be buried at the crossroads with a stake through their heart. The idea was that the murderer's ghost would not be able to rise because of the stake, and even if they did, they would become disorientated by the crossroads and not be able to walk. The most famous example of this in London is perhaps John Williams, who was accused of the dreadful Ratcliffe Highway murders. In December 1811, 2 families were violently murdered in their own homes near Ratcliffe Highway. And Seaman John Williams was accused of the murders on the somewhat shaky evidence. Williams hanged himself in his cell, but was still declared guilty in a posthumous trial. He was buried at the crossroads of Cannon Street and Cable Street. The last crossroads burial in London was in 1822, near where Victoria Railway Station is now. In Manor Park, there is a legend of a being called One-Eyed Jack. He is said to live with his large black dog in an empty house around Manor Park. The local law states that One-Eyed Jack sets his dog on people walking alone past the house at night in order to steal their eyes. The Theatre Royal, Stratford East, is haunted by the ghost of Freddie Fredericks, one of the first managers of the theatre. Fredericks walks around the theatre at midnight. He's described as a short, stout man wearing brown and is always very friendly. He's been caught on CCTV and cameras a couple of times. Frederick's initials are painted on the proscenium arch, and there's a superstition that if the initials are ever removed, the theatre will fall down. In Epping Forest, there is a legend of a local lost pool. The forest has several small ponds. One is actually referred to as the Lost Pool. However, there is a belief that there is another mysterious pool which draws people towards it with dark thoughts. 50 years ago, there was an attempt to find this mysterious pool. One woman said she'd found it, but refused to mark it on a map because, as she reported, it was evil beyond measure. Epping Forest is rich with ghosts, including a headless horseman, a motorcyclist, horse-drawn carriage, and of course, the ghost of Dick Turpin. Again. The ghost of Boudica and other Celtic warriors have been seen and heard. It is said that the Celts used Epping Forest as a camp during their resistance against the invading Romans. Visitors who leave a car in neutral near a place called Hangman's Hill experience a strange phenomena. where their car appears to roll uphill against all rules of gravity. Although investigators have suggested this could be the result of an optical illusion.
Spoils.
A tricky one to include in the section on superstitions, but two of Spring Hill Jack's most well-known attacks were in East London. In the 1830s, people, usually women, in different parts of London were attacked by a creature with claws and breathing fire and could leap high in the air. Jane Alsop was attacked in Old Ford. Around 9 days later, Lucy Scales and her sister were attacked in Limehouse. Many, even at the time, believed that Spring Hill Jack was an aristocrat with too much time and money on his hands. Whether he was a real person or not, the name of Spring Hill Jack came to be a synonym for devil or demon and was used to describe any frightening, unexplained creature, not just in London, but across the country. Some have even suggested that the original Spring Hill Jack was indeed some sort of cryptid, alien or demon. Paranormal Jack the Ripper.
So any tour of the, quite frankly, fascinating and rich history of East London does tend to include mentions of Jack the Ripper. And there are a few kind of paranormal aspects attached to the case. Just in brief, in the autumn of 1888, 5 women were killed horribly by a terrible killer who's never been, the identity of whom has never been discovered. He was known as the Whitechapel murderer at the time, or Jack the Ripper at the time as well, and since. The identity of the crimes, so nobody knows who the killer was at the time or since, but some at the time and since have suggested that the crimes were so heinous, so awful, that the killer was a demon or a devil of some description. And others have suggested that it was some kind of satanic ritual, that it was a ritualistic killing. At the time of the murders in 1888, the police and the press received hundreds, thousands of letters from people. You may have heard of a few of the famous ones, but there were hundreds and thousands of them from people claiming to be Jack the Ripper, from people claiming to know who Jack the Ripper was. And a lot of these were from psychics. Many of them, anyway, were from psychics. There was a clergyman from Essex who wrote to the police to say that he'd had a dream and he knew exactly who Jack the Ripper was. In fact, it was 2 men. He knew their names and he knew exactly where they were going to be at a certain time on a certain date in London, and told the police, well, if you go there, then you'll see these 2 men and there will be something incriminating about them and you'll know that they're Jack the Ripper. Police ignored that one, so we'll never know if that was a prophetic dream. But there was a chap, Robert James Lees, a spiritualist, who badgered the police so much that he actually claimed he had helped with the case. Lees said that he found the killer psychically, and that the police knew who the killer was, but everyone had agreed for some reason to say nothing about it. The only thing he would say was that the killer was in a psychiatric hospital and would never be let out. When Lees died in the 1930s, his family said that he was the last person who knew Jack the Ripper's name. So he claimed that he psychically knew who the killer was and had told the police. So the canonical 5 victims of these terrible crimes were all women who lived locally in the East End, in areas like this. This is a 19th century photograph of a street in the East End. And for the months and years after, directly following 1888, their ghosts were seen a lot by locals. So the locals reported a lot that they'd heard the noises of the murders, or that they'd seen the ghosts of the unfortunate victims, many of whom would have known these women. I do think that's an interesting sort of thing. I mean, some of the theories I've heard about why ghosts exist, why people report ghosts, is there's the theory about stone memory, that very traumatic events are imprinted on the stone. There's the theory that the kind of Jungian theory of collective memory, that if there's a particularly traumatic event in a community, then that event will kind of replay itself in the collective subconscious of everyone involved. And if anything kind of is a traumatic event, then those horrible killings in 1888 certainly had their effect on the people of the East End. So perhaps that's why, particularly because the sights and sounds seem to have dissipated over the time in the East End. But there are still a few ghosts of those poor, unfortunate women who are still reported. So the first victim was Mary Ann Nichols, who was murdered in a place called Bucks Row, which is now Durward Street. This is the then and now sort of from Google Images. As recently as the 1980s, it was reported that horses going down the street would react very strangely, put their ears back, sort of start whinnying, and dogs strain at the leads to go past the spot where Nichols died. As you can see, it's being heavily redeveloped. So hopefully that energy will dissipate. This is Hanbury Street in the 1930s, so fairly long after 1888. A resident of Hanbury Street reported seeing a couple in Victorian clothing disappearing through a door at the building opposite, which used to be an alleyway leading to where poor Annie Chapman was murdered on the 8th of September. Where Annie Chapman was murdered, in the Google Street View here, it's on the left. It's now part of Truman Brewery, what was Truman Brewery. And when it was still a brewery, the brewers described that on the anniversary of Annie Chapman's death, they would feel a cold, unexplained chill sweeping through the brewery. The 30th of September, 1888, there were two killings, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. This is Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes was killed, again, then and now. On the anniversary of the murders, it's said that there is a glow seen in the corner where Eddowes was killed, which is actually nearest to where the Google Street View is. And a foul smell can be smelled, the sort of smell of the 19th century. I do have my own story here. I did used to, slightly reluctantly, conduct Jack the Ripper tours of this area of East London. And I was conducting a tour one day, it was quite some time afterwards, when a customer emailed me a photo that she had taken while we were standing in Mitre Square. Now, this was at the time where there was a bench almost right in front of where the Google Street View car is. She'd taken a photo of this bench because I used to slightly dramatically say it was the site of the bench. It was in that approximate area. I wasn't completely lying. She'd taken a photo of the bench and she sent it to me very excitedly. This is the photo that she sent me. She said in the email that she sent to me as well, she seemed very knowledgeable about kind of paranormal things. She said that these are orbs, those round things in the middle of the screen there, and that the red orb down in the left-hand corner is very unusual. And she said that orbs are what happens before a ghost manifests itself. I wish I could remember whether the tour I did was on the anniversary of Eddowes' death, but I honestly can't say I can. Looks like spring with the daffodils there, doesn't it? And as we spare a thought for those poor women who succumbed to the hands of Jack the Ripper, my last story is a personal story. I did used to live in East London. If you've seen some of our other episodes, you might have noticed I lay claim to living in virtually every area of London. But one of the places I've lived was Whitechapel when I was quite small. So we were living in Whitechapel in the building that's pictured here, not quite as long ago as that. So the building had been a workhouse run by various people, including the Salvation Army and the Victorian philanthropist. This is it under its Salvation Army guise. Not that long before my family moved in the 1980s, it had been converted to flats, but only part of the building had been converted to flats. And I have to say, it was the spookiest place I have ever lived. Now, workhouses were not, I mean, there's a couple more pictures of this particular workhouse when it was a workhouse. They were not particularly pleasant places to live. I mean, you can see the men are very tightly packed together. You had to queue outside to get in. So there goes your chance. It was kind of the blood of the Victorian port, these workhouses. And this building, and I wish I could explain to you, I wish I could tell you exactly why it was very, very spooky, but I was so tiny that all I remember is a vague sense of fear. If my bedroom was right at the other end of the flat to where the empty bit, our flat backed onto the empty bit of the building. And my brother's bedroom was right next to the door that connected with the derelict bit of the workhouse. And if I had to go and get my brother for some reason, go and tell your brother his dinner's ready, I would run to the end of the flat, scream his name, dinner's ready, and then run back again to safety. It wasn't my brother. He was a lovely big brother. So it wasn't him I was scared of, but there was something at that end of the flat that I was absolutely terrified of. I vaguely remember that our pets, the dog and the cats, wouldn't go near that end of the flat either. And we knew the people who'd lived in the flat just before us, who had a girl of about my age, and she refused to go at that end of the flat as well. So it was definitely a weird. We moved from that area before I could form any clear memories of why I was so frightened. Moved to another area of the East End, and they do say very young children and animals have a kind of extrasensory perception of these weird things. So whether I was just picking up on the atmosphere of the derelict building or the terrible poverty that had happened there, I don't like to say. The building isn't there, it's been knocked down. I haven't been back to the site just in case I get freaked out again. I would return to being that terrified 6-year-old. And as my childhood nightmares return, that's all for today. Thank you very much. I hope you've heard some good ghost stories there about East London. We do these for free, but if you can find it in your heart to make a small donation to the Multiple Sclerosis Society via the donate page at www.londonhistoryathome.com, we would very much appreciate it. Please subscribe and like. We're new to this virtual tour guiding thing, but we've got lots of ideas for things to do. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.